if you, like, at any point want to donate, or we'll also be holding it at the door at the end. We'd like to remind everyone that on campus we have a safe space policy, which means basically, in short, no harassment, no racism, nothing that makes anyone uncomfortable. We've spoken to campus security who've told us that they don't want this event to be filmed. We've got someone filming it, documenting it for our purposes, but otherwise they said that they have not given permission to anyone to record this talk. So if you're recording it, then you'll be asked to leave, like they're right outside. No heckling, no interrupting, very basic civilized rules that I hope all of us can follow. Yeah, so I think Amira is going to be chairing this talk. And yeah, okay, so, well, he has nothing to say right now. So, but yeah, so yeah, please everyone.
Can we shut the lights or dim them?
A little bit, yeah, maybe at the front.
So yeah, same way.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming out. I know that there's been quite a few events during this week on Palestine, so I'm glad that there are people who are also wanting to hear about the sorts of options that are available to people as a response to the crimes that Israel is committing. The time that we've got together now is not that long, I think because there's knitting happening here, is that right? At 7 o'clock, okay, which is that's a legitimate activity as well. So I'm going to keep my comments hopefully reasonably short, because then there'll be time for Q&A as well. And I know that the sort of the policies of Israeli apartheid and the specifics of Israeli crimes have been covered in other presentations and other events this week. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, although I am going to, I feel it's important to contextualize talking about BDS with a sort of brief overview of the reality on the ground. So I don't know, can everybody see this or not? Well, yeah. I'm only going to be saying what's on the screen anyway. So the first bit, I'm just going to say a little bit about Israeli apartheid, the basics. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about boycott, divestment and sanctions. And then the third one, wow, okay, that's fine. And the third bit, I'm going to talk about BDS and you, which presumably is all the people that I can't really see anymore. So I'm just going to say a little bit about Israeli apartheid, the basics. I mean, I'm assuming that a lot of people here know at least some of this. What exists currently in Palestine, Israel, is a de facto one state, in the sense that the Israeli government, the Israeli authorities control the lives of all the people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And in that regime, there is a regime of racist discrimination, where rights and privileges are granted or denied to people on ethno-religious criteria. For the Palestinians, this means that they are either second-class citizens, those who have got Israeli citizenship, where they live in an ethnocracy, in what is defined as a quote-unquote Jewish and democratic state, or they're under military rule, that's if you're Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, West Bank also including East Jerusalem, or excluded from their homeland entirely, as the refugee population is. And it's worth pointing out, of course, that the origins of this whole question is with the refugees and is with the Nakba, which is what the Arabic word for catastrophe, which is the ethnic cleansing that Israel perpetrated in Palestine in 1948, when the majority of Palestinians who would have been inside what became Israel were expelled and prevented ever since from returning home. Again, this is not the focus of my talk this evening, but just to mention it in brief, the sorts of apartheid policies that Israel perpetrates today vis-a-vis the Palestinians affect many key areas of regular life, such as the control of land, housing, natural resources, citizenship rights, family life, etc. There isn't an area of Palestinian life that is not affected by Israeli apartheid. And of course, Israeli apartheid also means military brutality, as we saw most horrifically over the summer with Israel's so-called Operation Protective Edge, when one of the most advanced militaries in the world bombed families to bits as they slept in their homes or as they broke fast, and more than 2,000 Palestinians were killed, including over 500 children, in the besieged, blockaded, majority refugee population Gaza Strip. So this is sort of the grim reality, and this is the basis from which we then proceed to say, what can we do about it? Now, normally when I do talks or presentations, or when there's a lot of presentations on this topic, this question comes right at the end. Normally I'm sort of focusing on this part, and then right at the end I'm saying, well, what can we do about it? or happily, in a way, that's the question I'm asking sort of nearer the beginning of this evening, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. Just before I do that, I'm going to wrap up the discussion on apartheid with a recommendation of one document, because, like I said, don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but there's one recommendation that I make to people to read if they want to learn more about the sorts of discriminatory policies that Israel is practicing today. It doesn't look very exciting, I suppose, depending on your point of view, but the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination does periodic reviews of countries that are a signatory to the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, which amusingly Israel is, and in 2012 that was its last periodic review, and I really recommend that people look that up and read it. It's not so long, but it's quite detailed, and that was the committee goes into some depth about the sorts of problematic policies that Israel's pursuing. For example, quote, segregation between Jewish and non-Jewish communities and a lack of equal access to land and property inside the pre-67 borders. Okay, so note that this discussion here by the UN Committee on segregation and a lack of equal access is inside the 1967 borders, inside so-called good Israel before 1967. And when it came to the West Bank, the UN Committee talked about a regime of de facto segregation severe enough to prompt a reminder of the prohibition of apartheid. Okay, that's the first time that that UN Committee has used the word apartheid in terms of its review of a state's practices since the time of South Africa. So, if that's the reality, what are we going to do about it? What is our response? Now, I want to also make it clear that Palestine solidarity is not synonymous with BDS. Okay, there are a number of ways of doing solidarity with the Palestinians, of demonstrating, exhibiting solidarity and showing support, and they're not all BDS, or they're not all BDS strategies. But the BDS campaign, as I'll sort of go into in a bit of detail now, has become one of the main and most important strategies that Palestine solidarity campaigners around the world have been pursuing with regards to holding Israel accountable. So, it stands for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, which everybody thankfully just abbreviates to BDS. This is a key sort of starting point for understanding the rationale of BDS and why Palestinians launched it as they did. So in 2004, in July, the International Court of Justice, which sits in The Hague, issued an advisory opinion, a historic advisory opinion, when having been asked by the UN General Assembly to produce an opinion on the legality or illegality of Israel's apartheid wall in the occupied territories. That advisory opinion that the ICJ issued, almost unanimously with one exception, who was the American judge, said that the wall is illegal in its entirety insofar as it's in the occupied territory. It should be torn down immediately, and compensation should be paid to the Palestinians whose lives have already been affected. There's also a number of other important aspects in that advisory opinion, so anybody who's interested in law or legal aspects of the whole situation, I know there must be somebody, then look up the ICJ advisory opinion as well, familiarise yourself with that, because they go into stuff about the nature of the occupied territories as being under occupied status, the relevancy of the Geneva Conventions, etc. Anyway, 2004 ICJ advisory opinion, it's a big victory in many ways, because it took a lot of hard work to get that advisory opinion. But what happened after that? How was the ICJ opinion then used? Well, to a large extent, not a lot. And actually, I also recommend people look up a paper that was published just today by the Palestinian think tank Al-Shabaka, and that's talking about the way in which the PLO and the PA have already got significant legal tools at their disposal to hold Israel to account without sort of acceding to other statutes, etc. But nothing much happened after this opinion, and a year later, Palestinian civil society organizations issued the call for boycott. So deliberately, exactly a year to the day after the ICJ advisory opinion had been published, the call for boycott. The call for boycott contains three basic demands: the end of Israeli military occupation of Arab lands, the equality and the end to systematic discrimination for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the right of return as enshrined under international law for the Palestinian refugee population. That call from Palestinian groups was supported in that first instance by more than 170 different Palestinian civil society organizations representing a wide variety of society, trade unions, faith communities, political associations, etc., etc. The US campaign to end the Israeli occupation defined boycott strategies in this way, and I thought it was quite helpful and maybe a bit demystified. They talk about it as the application of pressure to change government and corporate practices, a grassroots movement's tactic to achieve social justice. Okay, and I think that's sort of a definition that's applicable to a whole wide variety of boycott campaigns on different issues, and it's relevant in this case as well. I'm just going to say a few things about what I think, and obviously what other people think as well, are the strengths of the BDS campaign. Firstly, boycotts and divestments have a rich historical legacy from other struggles in other countries and other times, and now as well. And that's something that I think is something for activists to draw on as we apply boycott strategies in the case of Israel. Secondly, and for me this is critical, and this is why I began even a talk on BDS with a brief overview of Israeli apartheid policies. The great thing about BDS as a campaign and as a tactic is that it puts the focus sharply on the lived reality of the colonized. It puts the focus sharply on the experience of Palestinians under Israeli apartheid. Because when you go to a company, or when you target a company because they are complicit in, for example, the supplying of parts for the bulldozing of Palestinian homes, that means that your campaign is based on that specific aspect of Israeli apartheid, that specific aspect of the Palestinians' lived reality, i.e. the discriminatory housing regime and the demolition of their homes. And in a context, still in the West, where the dominant paradigm is shaped by the priorities and perspectives of the colonizer, I think it's fantastic there is a campaign at our disposal, tactics at our disposal, that puts the perspective, that is shaped by the perspective of the colonized. Secondly, and this is one of the reasons why it gets Israel and its apologists particularly worried, BDS is about accountability and ending the impunity that Israel has enjoyed for so long. You might have heard the quite feeble charge of why are you singling Israel out, quote unquote. Actually, Israel has already been singled out for decades of support, decades of assistance, even as it contravenes and breaches international law and international regulations. So BDS, and this is why it was issued a year after the ICJ advisory opinion, BDS is about ending the impunity that Israel has enjoyed, and actually also ending complicity that corporations and other institutions and bodies have with Israeli apartheid too. And finally, and again I spoke to somebody just before we came in who talked about the fact that there'd been a vigil today on campus where the names of Palestinians who had been killed by Israel were read out loud. I think that's correct. That's quite a draining experience, I mean, physically, emotionally, and I think a lot of people, when they watch a film or when they attend a vigil like that, or even when they just start to learn about what's happening in Palestine, it can be quite a draining, dispiriting experience because you are sort of getting to know a little bit of the horrific nature of Israeli colonization practices. But BDS offers a response to that question of what can I do? Okay? When people can feel apathetic and what difference can one person make type thoughts, BDS strategies say actually, with other people, it is possible to make a real difference. So in that case, it educates and empowers solidarity activists as they try to make a difference. Is it going, am I going too fast? It's all right?
Perfect.
Okay. So just a few comments about growing successes. This has been happening over the last sort of, 9 years now. Last year, at the end of last year, the UK government issued a warning to businesses based in this country about doing business with Israeli companies that are based in the occupied territories, okay, based in the illegal colonies. And the warning was based on potential economic damage to your company by doing business with those people, as well as reputational risks as well. So there's an economic and reputational risk associated, even by the British government standards, of doing business with Israeli companies that are trading based in the occupied territories. These examples are sort of a bit haphazard with no particular. I'm just giving you a few random examples. G4S, which I will come back to actually. The large security company has lost contracts at Southampton and KCL after student-based campaigning. A few different academic scholarly associations, particularly in the US, have signed up to the academic boycott campaign, which I will also be coming back to. A Norwegian government-run $810 billion fund is excluded to Israeli firms, and a Dutch pension fund is also divested from Israeli banks. That final act of divestment is quite interesting because it actually advanced the discussion a little bit further. For a while now, quite a few people have been prepared to accept the idea of boycotting, say, dates produced in an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. The boycott of Israeli banks is based on the fact that while they're not literally based in the West Bank as an entire entity, the Israeli bank in question is complicit with Israeli occupation in numerous ways in terms of providing financing for settlements, mortgages, loans, etc., as well as in some cases having literal branches. So it takes the question of complicity, that necessary bit, much further, which is also relevant to when we come to the academic boycott as well. Now, because of all that, Israel is worried, okay, and I'm just going to sort of touch on this a little bit. The boycott of Israel and Israel's growing isolation in numerous arenas is discussed frequently by Israeli politicians, Israeli think tanks, Israeli op-ed writers, etc. A few years ago now, an Israeli think tank called the Reut Institute invested a lot of time and energy in writing a report which subsequently became a sort of guide for how to fight Palestine solidarity in BDS strategies. So it's just a topic that they're talking about a lot. Needless to say, and I'm sure this is something that people here might have had experience with too, as BDS has grown and as Palestine solidarity in general has grown and strengthened, there's been the pushback from the Israeli government and from the groups that lobby for and apologise on behalf of the Israeli government. Again, I haven't got time to go into all of these in sort of a lot of detail, but the kind of strategies that the anti-BDS pushback has been employing includes rebranding, which is basically the idea that if you think about Israel in terms of nice beaches and nightclubs and, I don't know, discovering yourself in the Negev or something, then you won't associate it with all that nasty apartheid and ethnic cleansing stuff. Paid trips for opinion formers and influential people, lawfare, which is basically the use of legal threats against institutions who are pursuing boycott strategies, and of course, an oldie but goodie, the anti-Semitism smear. The sort of discourse that the pushback against BDS employs is quite interesting, and again, this is quite prominent often on campus, in the campus context. So, as I've said, you'll be accused of singling out Israel, you'll be accused of being divisive, a paradigm will be established of quote-unquote extremism versus dialogue, hate speech potentially, and stupid slogans like bridges not boycott and things like this. So this is about as good as it gets. Now, unfortunately, in some cases that works, but this is literally as good as it gets, okay? So if you can find a way, which isn't too difficult, to argue around this, and argue that ending complicity in systematic human rights abuses is probably the opposite of extremism and the opposite of hate speech, then you should be doing fine. So to summarise, sort of BDS, it's in general, number one, it's a tactic. Now that's not even many letters on my keyboard, but that's quite an important point in and of itself. Okay, BDS as a thing can't free Palestine. BDS as a thing is not the be-all and end-all. BDS is one tactic, one strategy that is important for international solidarity groups and individuals to be pursuing. Okay? Ultimately, it has to be occurring in parallel with Palestinian political strategies themselves. But if we're thinking about assuming that most people here are sort of non-Palestinian British-based people, BDS is an answer to that question of what we can do. Secondly, it's a response to a call from Palestinians. It's a response to a call from the colonized, occupied people, saying to us what they would like us to do. Thirdly, it's based on international law and human rights. And sort of nice way to round it up for me, it's a non-violent, creative alternative to Israeli impunity. And contrary to what some people would say, it's actually a sign of hope, not despair. It's a sign that it's actually possible to believe in a better situation than what exists now. It's possible to believe in a situation where our institutions are not complicit in the dispossession of another people. So I'm going to move on to BDS and you and me, having hopefully sort of covered the basics on BDS in general. So I'm going to make some sort of points about doing BDS on campus that would be, I mean, take from it what you will. Like, hopefully it'll be useful. And most of these points actually can be applied in other contexts or other campuses. So anyway, right. So number one, the aim is that you're organising to get an institution to commit to some form of boycott. The sort of possibilities that you've got or options are things like divestment, where you're looking at what sort of funds that the university is investing in different ways, sort of procurement and the different contracts that the university might have with different companies. You know, what does the campus shop stock, things like this. There's sort of a variety of, you know, what sort of institutional ties does the university have. There's a bunch of different options. The key thing is, when you're sort of thinking about doing a BDS campaign, and again, apologies for people for whom this is already like second nature, but the key thing is to initially do that research at the beginning, because any successful BDS campaign is going to have to be grounded in solid research. Okay, because there's no point getting halfway through the campaign to discover that X, Y, or Z wasn't accurate. Okay, so do the research, identify a target, and be strategic. Okay, again, this bit here is related. Right, you have to think about, well, what is going to be a target that is strategic for us? What's a realistic ask? These are the sorts of questions that you have to think about. What's going to make sense in our own particular campus climate or environment? Also important is build a coalition and make allies. Unfortunately for the Zionists, their coalition is basically people who believe in a racist state and Christian fundamentalists. So that's kind of pretty much their coalition. Now you guys can build a coalition that's much broader and much wider than that, because you can bring in groups that believe in things like human rights and democracy, okay? And you will discover, of course, that there are more people willing to sign up to that than that former package. But this is, sort of, you know, flippancy aside, that's a very important point. Because when it comes to the crunch, you need to be able to have a strong sort of base and group that is pushing for a particular ask, okay? And in addition, this means that Palestine solidarity in BDS is actually also a way of showing solidarity with other people's struggles too, and other issues. And G4S is a good example of that, which as I said, I'll mention in a second. And also make a sustainable plan for the long haul, because a BDS campaign is not necessarily a sort of term thing, right? Actually, you might need to do some groundwork. Now, I know this is difficult on campus because often there's a high turnover of people who are coming in and going in, etc. But as much as it's possible to do it, when necessary, think in the long term. Because it might be that you need to have a term on education, for example, and then have a term on the actual campaign itself. And finally, you know, kind of obvious, I guess, campaign and educate and be creative. But the reason why I put this in is not just because it's sort of an obvious thing to say, but because the education part is an intrinsic part of BDS and Palestine solidarity work in a way that makes a BDS campaign a sort of win-win. And by that what I mean is if you have a particular campaign target on a campus or elsewhere, and you work on it, it's well researched, you go for it, you do the organising, you've built your coalition, you do it, and at the end of the day, for whatever reason, you don't achieve what you've set out to achieve, if you've been educating people in your community along the way about Israeli apartheid, then you have achieved something anyway. Okay, so even if that specific ask hasn't been got, you've got more people knowledgeable about and ready to do something themselves about Israeli apartheid. Okay? That's why, for example, it's very problematic for Israel's apologists to be combating BDS, particularly on campus, because the discussion typically ends up being how best to stop Israeli human rights abuses. Not do they exist, which is what the debate used to be. Now the debate is how best to stop them. And that's called progress. Now, we can say to them, this is the best way to do it. But at least the discussion is no longer about does this exist or does it not exist. Now the discussion is how best can we end it and how best can we do our part to end it. Right, now I've put three companies on this slide because sort of in discussions with organisers. I think it's relevant to the campus. I hope. Otherwise, it's just random information about 3 companies. But these are 3 companies. I'm just going to say something about. I won't take too long. Eden Springs UK, which is owned by Eden Springs, the Israeli company. G4S and Veolia. All right. I can sort of dimly see David at the back. Like, this is relevant, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
We've got Veolia bins on campus.
Okay, right. So
Kick them out.
Eden Springs, G4S and Veolia. Briefly, Eden Springs, the Israeli company, has a bottling plant and takes water out of the occupied Golan Heights, part of Syria that Israel occupied and subsequently illegally annexed after 1967. Right? The water that you might get from an Eden Springs water cooler in the UK is not coming from the occupied Golan Heights, but it's a subsidiary, 100% owned subsidiary, so the profits are going to this company that is benefiting from the illegal occupation and colonization of the occupied Golan Heights. G4S is a large security company who are unpleasant for a whole variety of reasons, including the privatization of prisons, including the mistreatment and ultimately, in one case, murder of illegal immigrants. So this is related to the issue about campus coalitions and campaigning. Like, the campaign against G4S in this country has involved Palestine solidarity groups working with groups that work on issues to do with detention and migration and all these things. G4S has a contract with the Israeli prison service and has also been involved in providing parts for aspects of the Israeli occupation regime in the West Bank, such as with the apartheid wall and checkpoints and settlements. Now, interestingly, in the case of, just to say something about the prisons, these are the prisons that G4S has the contract for, where Palestinians who have been seized by the occupying army are then taken to outside of the West Bank, which itself is in contravention of the Geneva Conventions. Now, in the case of G4S, a sustainable long-term campaign has been building for some time, with important wins along the way, and G4S has actually been responding to that pressure. Now, it's important to point out here, and this is just sort of a generic, useful point, that when it comes to a profit-making enterprise, like an enormous corporation, that clearly does not set a premium on respect for human rights or human dignity, it might not be a good idea to take them at their word when they tell you, we are going to do X, Y, or Z. So I say that in context of G4S because, encouragingly, and it's encouragingly, the indications are that they will actually not be seeking to renew their contracts with the Israeli prison service, and also pulling out of their complicity and involvement in the occupied territories. So that's good. And it's undoubtedly a result of the pressure that has been mounting in institutions and in a variety of different campaigns. But of course, it hasn't happened, and they are still a target for as long as they are complicit in Israeli apartheid. Similar story in a way, actually, with Veolia. Veolia is a French multinational that does a lot of different stuff. I think someone said that they have bins on campus, right? So in this country, most people know them in terms of waste management services. They've had a presence in Israel, particularly with transportation for some time, providing sort of owning companies that provide bus services. They've had a role in the Jerusalem Light Rail, which is part of the infrastructure connecting illegal colonies up with the pre-67 territory. And they've also been providing, managing sort of big rubbish dumps in the occupied West Bank as well. Anyway, Veolia has been a long-standing target by students, by Palestine solidarity activists in general, around the world actually. And this summer, Veolia said that they intend to pull out of Israel entirely as a marketplace, quote unquote. That was what their spokesperson claimed. And again, that is clearly a direct response to the pressure that they've been under in this country and a variety of other countries, that it just doesn't become a sustainable, or it doesn't make sense for them to be doing business there. And that's an important point to make, okay, about BDS and boycott strategies in general. A lot of the time, especially when it comes to Israel and Palestine, you can have a very crazy, intense discussion about boycott that in some ways often can miss the point. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, to give you sort of a scenario, that you had a shop in your community that did not pay employees its fair wages, all right? Now, initially, you might go to, imagine, crazy idea, right? Let's imagine that you go to the owner of the shop and you're like, hey, you're not paying people a fair wage, this is not acceptable, think about it, where's your heart, right, type approach. Now, that might not work, because the guy might be like, I don't care, I'm making more money this way. So then you might decide that it's better actually to organise a boycott of this guy's shop, you know, obviously in consultation with the workers, etc., until that practice ends. Okay? And that is the basic sort of premise of boycott throughout the ages, that you're not trying to win over on a moral level. I mean, that, you know, it'd be great if that was possible, but you're not trying to win over on a moral level the party that is benefiting from a situation of structural injustice or oppression. You're actually making that situation unsustainable for the party or parties who are benefiting from it. Okay, and that's the specific logic when it comes to corporations that are targeted, but actually it informs the wider logic of BDS more generally. So anyway, I've just sort of thrown those up and said a little bit about them. Definitely encourage people to look them up online. The BDS website, produced by the Boycott National Committee, has got information about these companies. There are other websites that have information about these companies. So read about them, and these are obviously possibilities for people on this campus, which is why I've mentioned them. Now, finally, I wanted to mention the academic boycott. Now, as far as I'm aware, and like people shout out whatever if this is wrong, but the University of Sussex sent some sort of team or delegation or whatever over to Israel to sort of have meetings or explore the possibility of institutional ties with a variety of Israeli universities. So it's important. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to mention specifically the academic boycott campaign, also because it can often be misunderstood as well. So this following quotation, forgive me, like it's a bit long, but I think it's just important to read it out as it is. This following quotation is from Packby.
It's come on.
Sorry?
It's not on the screen.
No, it's just because I took it off. It's because I don't want you reading it while I'm saying this point. Intentional. This quotation is from Packby, which is the Palestinian sort of body that's part of the general BDS campaign, specifically focusing on academic and cultural boycott. And again, I'd really encourage people that if you're looking to dig a little deeper into the rationale, the theory, and the practical application of boycott as a campaign, please visit the PACB website to have a look at the guidelines that they have meticulously produced when it comes to cultural and academic boycott. So, and now it reappears. Okay, so the call is for, quote, a boycott of Israeli academic and cultural institutions based on the premise that these institutions are complicit in the system of oppression that has denied Palestinians their basic rights guaranteed by international law. Okay? It's based on the idea that you're dealing with an institution that is complicit in the infringement and denial of basic Palestinian human rights. This is from a 2009 report done by activists, Jewish and Palestinian activists, and they put it like this: Israeli academic institutions have not opted to take a neutral, apolitical position toward the Israeli occupation, but to fully support the Israeli security forces and policies towards the Palestinians. Okay? That includes within it a very important point, because often when you're dealing with things like academic and cultural boycott, the pushback can come, well, why are you trying to politicize academia? Things like this. Well, it's already politicized. Okay? Because in their laboratories, they're manufacturing new techniques and new weapons to kill Palestinians. That sounds pretty political to me. It's already politicized because their departments are fine-honing theories about how best to control an occupied, colonized population. And this quotation I've included, sorry, I'm just doing this thing again, where I remind myself what's about to happen and then remember I need to contextualize it. So this comment is from a person who's actually opposed to the academic boycott, who would define herself as a liberal Zionist. However, she helpfully has given us this quotation as part of a longer article, which helps us to make the case for academic boycott. Israel's educational network, regardless of the political persuasions of faculty, is already entrenched in the occupation. Israel's educational network, regardless of the political persuasions of faculty, is already entrenched in the occupation. Okay? And in the rest of this article, she's talking about the way in which the occupation does not respect the green line. Okay, the green line being the, in theory, border or line between territory that Israel occupied before and after 1967. She's saying that the occupation does not respect the green line, by which she means it's not possible to point a finger at a sort of farmer in a West Bank settlement and to say that's the person who's benefiting from the occupation. No. She's saying that Israeli society much more broadly, Israeli institutions much more broadly, are benefiting from and are complicit in the Israeli occupation. That, remember, from a person who opposes boycott and defends Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So just two examples out of the ones that I could give. This is one university that I believe, well, I think they went to like a bunch of them, but so this is the Technion University, and I've just given you a few examples of the way in which this university is complicit. Scientists there helped develop the remote control bulldozer that is used by the Israeli army to demolish Palestinian homes. The university offers tailored, that's their language, tailored programs for the Israeli Defense Forces and the Ministry of Defense. And it also has a close relationship with companies like Elbit Systems, which is a large Israeli defense contractor manufacturer. The Elbit Systems, for example, produces the drones that are used to kill Palestinians in Gaza. Tel Aviv University, another example that I picked just for sake of argument. Tel Aviv University boasts of, these universities are proud of their association with the security forces, boasts of its role, quote, at the front line of the critical work to maintain Israel's military and technological edge, including 55 projects funded by the MOD's Research and Development Directorate. And in fact, in Tel Aviv's case, the campus itself includes land that belonged to the ethnically cleansed and destroyed Palestinian village of Sheikh Mohannes, okay? So, again, for sake of time, I'm not going through all the different universities and all the ways in which they're complicit, but it's out there. The information is out there. I'm actually going to try and compile it in a way shortly, but the information is out there, and that is the key basis. That's the foundation of an academic boycott campaign. Just as the basis for any other boycott campaign is the facts on the ground and the policies of the institution or target in question. This is the last slide. We've done it. These are the words of Yonatan Shapira. He used to fight in the Israeli Air Force. His father fought in the Israeli Air Force. And finally, he was so disgusted by what the Air Force was doing, by what the military is doing, by what the government is doing, that he quit the army and he decided to join in and participate in boycott campaigns. He's part of the Israeli group Boycott from Within. And this is how he put it. It is no longer enough to try and change Israel from within. Israel has to be pressured in the same way apartheid South Africa was forced to change. Thanks very much.
We're going to go to question and answers now, but unfortunately we're really pressed for time. We have this room for another 15 minutes, so we're going to take, I think, 3 questions at a time and no follow-ups. So you ask a question, you get an answer, and that's it.
What you consider to be Israeli colonialism, forgetting that at the heart of this issue is the Palestinian people. So if we look at, for example, SodaStream, you can see from the publicly available financial information they have 900 Palestinians employed and 200 non-Palestinians. Each of these Palestinians earns 30% of the average income of other Palestinians in the West Bank and 2.5 times as much as Palestinians in Gaza. Now, aside from trying to spite Israel by boycotting this institution, how does this benefit the Palestinian people who are currently relying on this company and other companies for their income?
Yeah, my question was, thanks, and it was great. My question was, what do you think of when people say, like, in terms of the academic boycott or the cultural boycott, when people say we're punishing people who have nothing to do with the occupation or with the apartheid system in Palestine, and because a lot of people like have that thought, and I think it would be good to answer it. And
if Israel is an apartheid state, why are there Arabs serving in the Knesset? Why are the Druze serving in the Israeli army? And perhaps your entire premise needs to be re-looked at in terms of what real apartheid was in South Africa.
Right, let's try and go through these quickly. First question related to sort of SodaStream and the issue of boycott and affecting Palestinian workers. I mean, actually, the gentleman at the end just mentioned South Africa, and actually this was a similar argument that was advanced in the context of the struggle against apartheid South Africa. South African apartheid ministers, like Israeli ministers now, say that boycott just hurts Arabs more than anything else. I just want to question part of the framing of the final question, because you talked about aside from trying to spite Israel, but that obviously betrays a misunderstanding of the boycott campaign itself and the role in which it plays in terms of ending impunity, ensuring accountability, ending complicity, etc., etc. The call for boycott has come from Palestinians, not from me, like sitting at this table. And the only reason why Palestinians have to rely on crumbs from the table from Israeli companies is because Israeli apartheid has destroyed their own economy. Secondly, on the question of academic and cultural boycott, punishing people who've got nothing to do with it. Right. Myth busting. Okay, there's an idea that somehow there's this massive untapped support for Palestinian rights amongst so-called Jewish Israeli liberals. Doesn't exist, unfortunately. There are a few, Jewish Israelis who are comrades in a genuine anti-apartheid struggle, but by and large there is apathy or indeed open support for Israeli apartheid policies amongst Israeli academia, amongst the cultural institutions. As I mentioned before, please do, so I'm speaking really fast, but that's because I know there's a lot of questions. Please do check out the guidelines that I mentioned earlier, produced by PACB, the Palestinian body that does with academic and cultural boycott. It talks about the specific conditions in which a particular institution or entity is boycottable, which is to do with complicity in Israeli apartheid. Okay, so it's about institutional complicity, not about what a particular person or individual thinks or doesn't think. Thirdly, how can it be apartheid when there are the Arabs in Knesset? Yes, there's Palestinian minority, that is 20% of the population that can vote, and they have some representatives in the Knesset. Reason why this doesn't prove anything or disprove anything is because the argument for Israeli apartheid is much broader than whether Palestinians who've got citizenship, which of course are the minority of the whole Palestinian population around the world, most of them don't have the chance to vote in the Knesset because they're under military rule or they've been ethnically cleansed from the land altogether. The Palestinians who do stand in the Knesset are subject to racist and persistent harassment for their political activities. Haneen Za'abi, for example, is currently not able to participate in Knesset debates because of her political activism on behalf of the Palestinian people. And sort of one could go on there. In all of the Israeli governments since 1948, there has never ever been a Palestinian party as part of a governing coalition. There's been 2 non-Jewish ministers since 1948 as well. So as a point sort of in favour of Israel, it actually opens up a whole can of worms that you probably won't appreciate. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
John.
What's the argument?
Again.
So take a question from students first.
That was designed. Just recently we've heard of the Israelis doing what they like to call putting the Palestinians on a diet.
Yep.
And I think one of the main concerns with boycotting, of course, is will we be choking off their supply lines, starting them off in Gaza through doing a boycott campaign that angers the Israelis and causes them to do that kind of thing, forces their hand, as it were.
Sorry, go ahead.
One thing I was going to ask when you were talking about the anti-Semitism smear thing, of course that is going to be a tactic that is used, but in terms of working with the BDS movement, which I am obviously in favour in, is there a way that you think is possible of actually dealing with anti-Semitism that is on a rise, which isn't just a smear, that is a reality? Because I don't think that is entirely a smear, and it's not saying that people are being completely aggressive, but there is some people on an extremist level that turn racism in another direction.
That's for the gentleman.
For those who don't know, the 2 guys who just left, the Ray Winston lookalike was Simon Cobbs, who was the person who set up the counter-Zionist protest to our campaign in SodaStream 2 years ago. So Simon Cobbs, Sussex Friends of Israel. So they've gone, thankfully. My question was, the BDS call was in 2005. Obviously, it's approaching 10 years ago. I get the sense that the ball is starting to roll now, really starting to roll. Just like getting your opinion on that, in terms of really starting to have an effect.
Yeah.
The last.
Right. Okay. So all right. Well, the phrase "putting Palestinians on a diet" comes from a former advisor to an Israeli prime minister who talked about the logic behind the blockade of the Gaza Strip. Who talked about the logic of collective punishment in terms of targeting the Palestinians in Gaza. I don't sort of get the idea of it's possible to sort of anger Israel more, in the sense that they've just committed an unprecedented massacre in the Gaza Strip, literally blowing children to pieces on the beach and in their own houses. The Palestinians in the Gaza Strip continue to live under a siege and a blockade. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, on a sort of minor level, can't study in West Bank universities. Their fishermen are shot at, etc., etc. And of course, the apartheid affects people elsewhere. Just to emphasise a point that I sort of feel is connected to this question and one before, for people who genuinely want to help the Palestinians, or who genuinely want to be in solidarity with Palestinians, it's clear what Palestinians want. They want people to boycott. Okay? If you don't genuinely care, you're simply using that as an excuse, okay. But if you really do care about helping Palestinians, they've made it crystal clear what they want people to do, without any shred of ambiguity whatsoever. And I want to listen to the voice of the colonised population in how I define my solidarity. Okay, secondly, the question about anti-Semitism. Now, I was unclear about whether you meant like there is anti-Semitism on the rise within Palestine solidarity groups, or like you're connecting it to the broader like societal picture that took place over the last few months. Do you mind just briefly clarify that? A bit of both. Okay.
Yeah.
So, on a personal level, I'm obviously involved in Palestine solidarity in general, speak at a lot of groups. I don't come across anti-Semitism. Obviously the basis of solidarity with the Palestinians is like an anti-racist struggle. The sorts of examples that I've seen over the summer of genuinely anti-Semitic behavioural statements have been like random members of the public who have been photographed at demonstrations and that sort of thing, holding up signs like Hitler is right and stuff like that. Like, thankfully, that is it's so marginal in the context of Palestine solidarity work, and all the people that I know are committed anti-racist activists who would give it no sort of time of day whatsoever. Unfortunately, the Jewish communal bodies and pro-Israel groups in this country have tried to blur the lines and smear Palestine solidarity activism, specifically in relation to the outpouring of anger about the Gaza massacre this summer, with the genuinely anti-Semitic stuff. And of course, the reason why that's particularly detrimental is that it actually makes people deaf to the real anti-Semitism that does exist. And that's, of course, actually ultimately, if they really cared about that, that would be something they would think about. But unfortunately, one gets the impression that their main target is trying to stymie Palestine solidarity rather than actually think about sort of communal relations and anti-racism. Actually, I'll just add one thing to that as well, which is that it's linked, but in the last few years, actually, okay, this is connected to the last question. I'll sort of lump it together. Like, in the last few years, there's been a genuine significant upsurge in support for the Palestinians amongst the British public, participation and involvement with BDS campaigns and so forth. Certainly a world away from, say, like 10, 15 years ago, which I do remember. But there's sort of still a limited critique space. So a British politician can go on the radio or go on the television and condemn Israeli settlements till the cows come home, and there's unlikely to be any consequences for that person, like in terms of career or admonishment or something like this. Okay, because it's now become an acceptable part of the mainstream discourse to sometimes quite heavily criticize Israel for settlements. Okay, there was discussion, unfortunately it didn't come to fruition, but there was discussion in the political mainstream this summer about an arms embargo, for example. Like, hopefully we'll work hard and we'll get that done properly. But this is the limited critique. Why I say it's limited? Because we're still in a situation whereby if a politician stood up and said, we have to ask serious questions about whether Israel has got a so-called right to be a Jewish state because of what that means for the Palestinian population, that politician probably would be in trouble. Okay, there probably would be consequences for that politician, and undoubtedly the anti-Semitism language would be used. It is not anti-Semitic to oppose the existence of Israel as a Jewish state for a number of different reasons. But critically, it's not anti-Semitic because it's an objection based on what that means for the Palestinian people. It's not a theoretical discussion about whether Jews should have self-determination or there should be a Jewish state somewhere. Okay, like that's a legitimate discussion in and of itself. But in the case of Israel, we're talking about an actual state that actually defines itself as Jewish, and because of that excludes a majority indigenous population. Okay, so I just wanted to like add that as like a quite large PS. And yeah, the ball rolling thing, yes, but like also it's critical that that people stay focused, that the pressure is maintained, that in the case of companies that have promised things, we make sure that that's happening. But for sure, everywhere you look, support for BDS is growing. And just to add something, I guess to finish, so people can knit, if you look at sort of the civil society level, you can see a lot of support for BDS strategies amongst cultural workers, amongst faith communities, amongst trade unions. And of course, the whole point, one of the points of all of that pressure is to affect the governmental level. And the governmental level is always the one that changes last, right? If you look at the sort of statements that are coming out from British politicians past and present, from EU sort of officials now, what you see is that people who actually are quite keen to do business with apartheid Israel are getting really frustrated. Okay, they're getting really frustrated because there's an Israeli government in power that even by Israel standards is to the right. And the next election won't go more moderate, right? There's not going to be some sort of rollback of the wave of Liebermans and Bennetts and Fagelins, okay? It's just going to go more to the right, or stay as it is, at the very least. And that means that people in the EU, people in worldwide governments, who, we don't get confused, we know what their interests are, but ultimately they're going to get frustrated by the behavior and practices of the Israeli government. And ultimately, things that until now they say are not on the table because of the peace process, things that are not on the table because of negotiations, those things will get back on the table. And those things will include things like boycotts, those things will include things like sanctions. And so that's our job, to continue that momentum until that happens.
Yeah, we can take just one more round of questions. Omar. So you and Khalid.
Thanks for your speech. Basically, regarding what you said at the end, regarding getting stuff back on the table on a governmental kind of level, do you think that this, simply because of the history of Europe and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and everything, do you think that we can ever, in the foreseeable future, see something where the European Union, for example, says we will do an Israeli embargo, regardless of how much frustration they might have, simply because of that history? Do you think that this is something that is possible?
Yeah.
I really want to talk about the role of the United Nations on the BTS. They have people on the ground. Numerous resolutions have been passed against Israel. Nothing been implemented. Do you think the United Nations is part of the problem on BDS, and particularly some Arab states who are working with Israel, namely Qatar, Jordan, and Egypt, which are hindering the BDS?
And so the last question.
Thanks, Ben, as always, for a very useful talk. Just to follow up the thing about the Palestinians' role in the boycott movement, I just wonder what you can tell us about what we hear is an emerging boycott movement within occupied Palestine. Now, this is an extraordinary development, if it's true, because it's not just that Palestinians, to quote Ilan Pappé, are turkeys calling for Christmas. They are actually finding ways of boycotting apartheid Israel from occupied Palestine. And this is extraordinary because almost all of the markets available to Palestine in both directions are Israeli. So I'd be very interested to know what you can tell us about that.
Okay. So the first question related to governmental level action in the EU and the sort of the weight and impact of history. and the Holocaust and the relationship between the governments and the Jewish people, etc. Well, I feel like that eventually the sort of level of frustration will build up to the extent whereby those factors don't disappear, but are ultimately don't prevent action. Now you can see that there is already frustration in public comments, in off-the-record comments. I think there is, leaders and populations that don't confuse history, fighting anti-Semitism in the present, particularly, for example, amongst the far right in Europe, and challenging Israeli apartheid and upholding the Palestinian people's basic rights. I think more and more people don't see those things as sort of mutually exclusive or in a sense related either. Okay, those are like two different things, and part of it's generational as well. Okay, part of it's generational in terms of populations' views towards this issue. So yeah, I think that overall, economic and political factors will, as they have done so far, will trump, let's say, memory or ideology, if we can put it like that. Secondly, the role of the UN. Right. So, I think the UN's a large entity, right? And within it, there are agencies and bodies and individuals who are doing a lot and have always done a lot for the Palestinian people. However, on a political dimension, the UN is as good or as bad as its member states, if that makes sense, or even more specifically, as good or bad as the whims of the Security Council, and particularly the Permanent Security Council members, who of course have the veto when it comes to the ultimate sort of highest level of political sanction or authority. And that's an issue and a problem that's obviously much bigger than Palestine and relates to how the whole global order has been structured since World War II at least. I would also flag up, and this is sort of a bigger topic as well, I'd also flag up the potentially problematic role of the UN in the so-called reconstruction of Gaza that's happening right now, and the questions being asked about whether the UN will actually be complicit in a sort of rubber-stamped siege that continues with Israeli involvement and UN and international complicity. So there's definitely big questions to be asked about the UN, even more direct and pertinent questions to be asked about the British government and the EU, about their open support for and complicity with what's happening there. And as well, like you mentioned too, the role of various Arab governments as well. Now, there is, for example, a small but growing BDS campaign within Jordan that has existed, that exists now, and that is working, for example, on the issue of gas importation. And there are sort of people within all these different groups who are working to change the status quo. For me, like, the role of the Arab states is sort of a different topic, in the sense of BDS is quite focused on our ability to campaign here, and the way in which the liberation of Palestine is affected by the regional context, in a sense, is a bit different, I think. And finally, the question about BDS within Palestine itself. Right, as you pointed out, the sort of saturation of Palestinian existence by Israeli occupation is pretty close to comprehensive. It's an Israeli company providing you water. It's an Israeli company providing you electricity. It's an Israeli company providing X, Y, or Z. And of course, like, on a deeper level, it's an Israeli checkpoint that allows you or doesn't allow you to reach your place of work or your relatives. So for Palestinians living under Israeli apartheid, the question of boycott is far more sort of problematic and difficult to implement. Yes, there have been and are movements within the occupied territories to support BDS, but the ability for that as a specific tactic to be a mass movement is limited by what I was just mentioning. There's also been the sometimes problematic way in which boycott strategies supported by the PA have been exclusively focused on settlement products, even at the same time as the Palestinian Authority is conducting security coordination with Israeli occupation forces who are arresting Palestinians. Okay, so that's also been a way in which it has been like not a sort of simple story, let's say. But I would like to say that in general, there is a lot of exciting green shoots amongst Palestinian youth who are taking things into their own hands, who are looking for a change in the status quo, both internally and externally. And that applies both inside 48 as well as it does inside the West Bank and Gaza Strip too. And that's part of what we've been witnessing recently as the young people especially have taken to the streets in East Jerusalem, in 48, in places like Kafr Khana and other places. So there are new ways of doing activism from within, but the extent to which it can be a boycott is obviously difficult.
Thank you.